Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online event looking at the funding of the NHS Estate of the Future. My name's Chris Naylor. I'm a Senior Fellow at the King's Funds, and I have the pleasure of chairing the event today. I'd like to start the session by thanking our event sponsor, NHS Property Services, for helping us put on today's event. Now, we have a great panel of speakers representing a range of perspectives from across the system that we're going to hear from in a minute. We're also lucky enough to have a fantastic audience here today. We checked just before coming on live, and 800 people have signed up for the event, and that's great because we're going to be coming to you for your questions in the second part of the session, and I'm going to tell you how to submit your questions. So just to explain a little bit how this is going to work, I'm going to be posing a few opening questions to our panel, and then I'm going to be taking questions from you in the audience. Please type your questions into the platform and I'll be reading them out on your behalf. We'll also be putting some polling questions to the audience. So these will flash up at various points during the session to the right side of the video. So please do take part in them. Also encourage you to share your thoughts on the conversation using social media. So we're using the hashtag KFOnline this morning. And one last thing before we get started, really recommend you have a look at the resources page on the platform. So on the left-hand side of the screen should be a menu with a series of options, and you can use that to navigate to the resources page. And there's a couple of recently released publications from NHS Property Services on that page, including the results of a national survey on estate funding and a new guide to estate funding, which contains some really helpful practical insights and advice. So before we come to the discussion, I just want to ask each of the panelists to introduce yourselves one at a time. Fiona, could you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and morning, everyone. It's great to be here today. I'm Fiona Daly. I'm the Director of Sustainability and Workforce and the National Deputy Director of Estates at NHS England.
Thank you, Fiona. Nicola?
Morning all. My name's Nicola Theron. I'm the Director of Estates for North Central London Integrated Care System. Really good to be here this morning. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicola. And Lucy?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lucy Gardner. I'm Chief Strategy and Partnerships Officer at Warrington and Holman Hospitals.
And finally, Kieran.
Hi, Chris. I'm Kieran Kinsler. I'm the Director of Advisory Services at
Hospitals.
NHS Property Services.
Fantastic. So thank you all of you for joining us this morning. I wanted to start the discussion by just posing a question to all of you about the challenges that we're facing. Just to set the scene, the survey that NHS Property Services did had some really interesting findings in terms of the challenges that people working in ICBs and in trusts say they're facing in terms of accessing funding, bringing together different funding streams, and so on. Where do you think we are in terms of the main challenges? What are the big issues that we need to tackle? I'll come to you in the same order, I think. So Fiona first, please.
Sure. Well, I think we could spend probably an hour each talking about this, but I think the funding challenges for the NHS have kind of been set out, really. So we've got the Darcy review. There's a £37 billion gap compared to our peers in capital funding. So I think the underspending capital funding over a period of time, that's playing out in a backlog maintenance bill for the NHS of just under £14 billion. I think it's £13.8 billion this year. So a huge amount of underinvestment in the estate. At the same time, we've got a brilliant new government who are peddling sort of their three shifts. So out into the community, moving more estate out into the community, going from analog to digital, and looking at more prevention-based treatment. So I think that in itself, also with the funding structures and mechanisms of the NHS, is going to bring a challenge. And we've also got the issue around workforce. We employ a huge amount of people in the NHS. We are struggling to attract and retain those people, and the built environment has a huge amount to play in that. So I think it's playing out into the kind of staff retention, as well as clearly our main focus, which is around creating excellent spaces for the patients in the hospitals and out into the communities. So I think, you know, we obviously welcome the new government's approach. They prioritise the NHS, they prioritise funding for the NHS, and that's been really welcomed. We obviously welcome the Chancellor's announcement in the uptick in capital this year. But I think there's still a lot to do in addressing that backlog maintenance bill. There's a lot to do around CDEL limits, those kind of mechanisms that are hampering organisations, even with cash, who can't spend it. We're still in very sort of short-term planning cycles in terms of our capital and revenue spends. And I think a focus on that we'll probably touch on a bit later in opportunities, but that's got to be a focus for us to get into longer-term planning. We've got a lot of different pots. You kind of alluded to it there, Chris, but you know, in the last couple of years, we've had the Targeted Investment Fund, we've had mental health dorm eradications, the Community Diagnostics Centre, A&E upgrade scheme, the RAC schemes, and the kind of list goes on. And I think if you were to take all of those pots of money and say, we've got that amount, what would we spend it on? I'm not sure. I think those things would be spent on, but you'd do it a bit more strategically. And I think that comes back to how we kind of think about money. I think the challenges around moving from acute out into the community, and this links into treatment, into prevention, that they are fundamental. The NHS payment mechanisms don't currently really support that. And we need to really think hard about how we can make that work. Things like the GP ownership model sometimes hampers upgrades into the community, and I think we need to get under the skin and unpick some of that. And then we've got obviously the future challenges, that things like the return of the lift estate and PFI estate coming towards us. You know, so I think all of those things are really what I'd say the sort of core challenges that we've got at the moment.
Thanks, Fiona. That's a really helpful sort of national overview to start with. Nicola, if we come to you, from your point of view, working in an integrated care board, what do you see as being the main challenges at the moment?
Yeah, so very much building on what Fiona's talked about. And I think I would focus on three particular areas that I think are the challenge for us from an integrated care board. The first of which is, and picking up Fiona's point, how do we allocate capital? How do we get capital into that sort of local care setting to enable that the left shift that we've just talked about? There are a number of approaches I think have been taken on that, but whatever goes into local care does not go into the acute sector. And it's getting that challenge around that. So that would be the first. The second of which is then getting delivery in local care to happen for all the reasons we know, the ownership model, the lack of track record that we've done recently, because post ETTF it's been quite difficult to make those local care models work. That is quite a complicated process to get money into primary care at the moment, more complicated perhaps than it should be, which then brings us back, I think, to the third point which I'd make, which is that approvals process, and just really trying to speed that process up. There are some really good precedents out there. I think the CDC program has been a really good example of how a strong, tight, light touch business case has enabled capital to flow out and to be matched by revenue into some quite innovative projects. And it's really about building on those good examples. So it'd be those three areas. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Thank you for setting out those three challenges very clearly, Nicola. So over to Lucy, and a provider perspective. How do you see things at the moment, Lucy?
Thank you. So I think Fiona's covered much of what I see as some of the challenges from a provider perspective. So the two key things from our perspective, I think, are there being insufficient capital investment in the first instance. And I guess to bring that to life for us, you know, we've bid in every phase of the New Hospitals programme and been unsuccessful, yet have Victorian buildings. So that kind of underinvestment is a real challenge, I think. And then that kind of multi-year planning, so that inability to plan capital spend across multiple years, I think also kind of prevents us from being able to take that really strategic view, which we need to across all providers. And that kind of links as well to the challenge that when there is funding available, it often has to be spent really quickly. And I think that coupled with rising construction costs often means that as NHS providers, we don't necessarily get the best deal in terms of construction. So they would be our key challenges from a provider perspective.
Thank you, Lucy. That's really helpful. And finally, to Kieran, same question to you. From sitting in NHS property services, what do you hear about as being the big challenges? What are the kind of challenges that came up in your survey earlier in the autumn?
I think actually many of the challenges that the panel have outlined, Chris, and from a non-NHS PS perspective, I think the aspiration to create a better estate fit for the future is a key pillar of our strategy. But like everybody else, we grapple with an aged estate. Right? I think in our response to the Darcy investigation, we highlighted that we spent an average about 66 million a year on backlog maintenance, but that's about 25 million short of investment to move our estate to a condition B. I think, like other NHS organisations, we have to work within a capital allocation budget and a CDL envelope, and we touched on in-year capital and not multi-year capital spends. And when we do secure funding for transformational customer projects, another one of those key challenges, something that was highlighted in the survey, is that we then need to deliver that project in an envelope that is affordable from a revenue and an operational cost perspective. So we might have the capital, we also have some revenue constraints that we need to grapple with. It's just some of the issues, and I'm sure we'll unpick more of those as the discussion continues.
I'm sure we will. Thank you, Kieran. And we are getting some questions in from the audience already, so please do keep those coming. Just as a reminder, you can submit your questions on the platform, and I'll be reading some of them out later on. So that's a really helpful kind of start, just by setting out some of the challenges that we're facing in the system at the moment. If maybe we turn to the opportunities, and particularly the opportunities that might exist to think differently about financing the NHS estate. If I could come to each of you in turn again for some thoughts on this. So Fiona, from your perspective in NHS England, it'd be great to hear a bit about what some of the most promising approaches you're seeing in different parts of the country look like, and also the support that's available nationally to help people to think differently about financing the estate.
Sure, yeah, no worries at all. I think I want to touch on a few things. So I'd say the first thing is really around partnership and innovation. And I start with that because we're seeing across the country this really leading to a lot of transformational change. If I talk about, so at NHS England, we run the P23 framework, which is a big construction framework. We deliver a lot of projects, big pipeline through it. I think we've delivered 66 projects since March 22 when the framework came out. And we do that in line with 23 different contractors who sit on the framework and are actively bringing their ideas and the ideas of the private sector into the public sector fold. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to basically take and learn the best of the best from what is out there in the private sector and apply that into the public sector. I also think that we've got a lot of innovation that we're not very good at scaling. And I think that in the sustainability space that I've spent a lot of time working in, we have these great ideas and they're pockets of ideas. But when it comes to scale, that's a real challenge. So we need to challenge ourselves about how we scale the very best practice and get that just in our kind of BAU DNA. From a productivity perspective, I think that there's a huge opportunity from a productivity perspective. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but we produced a report recently which showed that the estates and facilities community has delivered over £2 billion worth of productivity savings since the start of Carter, which was the sort of last big government push on productivity. That's a huge amount, the £16 per attendance. And that's been done through, again, through partnerships, through innovation, from focusing on things like non-clinical space. So where we have got estate that we don't need to use anymore, for sort of non-clinical activities, we turn that into clinical space, or we dispose of it. And we've got, a big sort of disposals program. And I think that really shows that as a community, we're very strong at finding opportunity in adversity, because that's against a kind of, period of austerity and that capital funding being constrained. So we've really, really delivered on that. I would say using money from others, huge opportunity for that. net zero is a great example of this. We have secured £1.2 billion over the last couple of years in additional funding from the PSDS funding, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. We've deployed money that's become available. I know many of you last year got the phone call that Lucy was talking about, saying we've got £40 million to shift in 3 months. Can you do it? Can we get some efficiencies off the back of it? And everybody's responded to that. And I would say that being ready with your projects there's a huge opportunity for us in that sort of, as we're doing long-term council planning, get your schemes ready for when funding becomes available. And then sort of structurally, I think we've got a massive opportunity with a 10-year plan. The NHS is just about to reshape how the NHS is with the 10-year plan. We've got the next spending review, and obviously we'll be bidding in for that. And I think we'll go in really strong if we've got good plans from ICBs, from organisations, from our partner organisations to say, this is what we need to really make the NHS estate fit for the future. I think that if we get back into the kind of DCPs, so your development plans, you get back into your longer term planning, that's really going to help with our spending review bids, as well as our kind of track record that we've built up of being able to deliver projects and deliver them really well and really quickly. And then, I mean, I probably almost shouldn't talk about private finance, but I think that there's a question, does private finance have a part to play in the future of the NHS? I think a lot of us are dealing with the kind of end point of PFIs looking to come back online, and that probably is something that we see there could be a lot of kind of risks with. But is there an opportunity for us to deploy private finance responsibly on what I would consider non-critical assets, but things that would help to make the NHS more resilient? So things like our supply chain resilience for sterile services, linen and laundry, things that aren't core functions of the NHS, but are required to enable the NHS to function.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That's really helpful, and not particularly directed at you, I don't think, Fiona, but we have had a request in from one person in the audience, which I probably should have started the session with, just to be mindful about technical language. We've got a mixed audience joining us today, not all of whom will be estates experts. So my job as chair is to remind you all on the use of acronyms and so on. So we're going to come to Nicola next. And so Nicola, as you happen to be next, I'm going to pick on you to explain to the audience about CDEL limits, because that's one bit of terminology we've had already, but also the sort of broader question. So again, you're working in an integrated care board, and ICBs are taking on more responsibility for thinking strategically about the future of estates. It'd be great to hear a bit about how you're approaching that, how you're connecting estates with wider strategic thinking in the system, and what you think some of the opportunities are to think differently about estates funding.
Thank you. And I will reference CDEL in passing, but I am not the expert on it, but it's a big constraint for all of us. I'd like to just respond, if I could, Chris, sort of at both a strategic level and at a transactional level, to sort of respond to your question briefly. I'm very much picking up the points that Fiona's made. So strategically, I think, and I picked this up at the beginning, was that what the ICB brings is a forum where strategic priorities can be identified at a system level. So we can get some clarity from a commissioner, from providers, from finance, and from all of the other directorates that sit within any ICB as to where our priorities are and where, therefore, we should be allocating that capital, that CDEL, that we have to spend within our system. And that CDEL constrains what we can do. It constrains how much funding we can put into projects, and is different to cash. So the ICBs help us to do that. And in our world, that has enabled us to strategically recognise that if we're going to invest in local care, we need to top slice, or we need to allocate some of that CDEL into funding the left shift into community and primary care. And I think that is really helpful, because what it brings is it brings consistency, and it brings a shared vision that if we're going to make that left shift work, we need to put some resource behind it. So there is that piece around the ICB is helping to make that happen. Secondly, what that has enabled us to do is to really start to be able to plan with a sort of short, a medium, and a tentatively long-term perspective. So to work out how we use that limited funding to be able to prioritise short-term activities, short-term projects, as well as those that might take the 3 to 5 year timescale and those that may follow. And that enables us to start to commit to leases and agreement for leases, perhaps earlier than we would otherwise be able to do. And it enables us to be able to work with the partners that Fiona was talking about to say, well, actually, in an area of regeneration, an area of growth and need, if we need to commit to something in 3 years' time, we start to have the ability to do that. And that, in a very small scale, is a really important step, I think, for us all to take. And providers have the ability to do it because clearly it's within their control. We've found it very difficult to do that in the primary care world. So from that innovation perspective, a longer term planning, a decision to allocate some of our capital into primary care helps us to start to build that pipeline. In our world, from a transactional perspective, what that's also enabled us to do is really talk to our council and private sector developer colleagues and recognise that if we can secure good shell and core projects, we can then use that small amount of capital to fit out, which provides us with revenue affordability. It gives us headroom. And that is the model that we are working with in many of our areas of growth in North Central London, and gives us, therefore, the ability to start planning affordable pipeline of projects and building that capacity and capability that Fiona has just talked about in order to be able to support that working. And using then some of what may be left, or where we may be able to bid for additional capital into a small works programme as well. So in our world, that's delivered 2 new larger projects in primary care since 2021, and a range of smaller projects, 15 or 20 a year, that help support the helpful narrative around core, flex and tail. So our narrative is around taking our flex investment to achieve core results through that process. So there's a sort of strategic piece here, and then there's a transactional piece here, both of which I think reflect on how we are going to move these opportunities forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. And just to make the points about CDEL completely clear for the audience, so this refers to the expenditure limits that the Department of Health has in relation to capital expenditure, and those limits then flow down to local organisations within the NHS and constrain the ability for a system to spend. So we'll come on to Lucy next. So Lucy, you've been quite creative in Warrington and Halton about how you've approached funding your estate. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the approaches that you've used and what's worked well, what some of the challenges have been?
Thanks, Chris. And this is the bit I get really excited about, so I'll try not to talk too much. But yeah, and I will start by saying I am not an estates professional either, for those members of the audience that are also not estates professionals, and I'm also not an accountant, although I will reference a couple of accountancy things which I shall try to explain. So I guess the first thing that we've done is we have been quite creative in terms of different funding sources that we've been able to access. And some of those are kind of standard NHS England funding sources, but we have also accessed funding from a number of different places as well. So in the last 2 years, just from a Warrington and Halton Hospitals perspective, I think we've accessed over 40 million additional funding from various programmes. Now, some of that I think people will be more familiar with. So things like the National CDC programme. Perhaps the ones that might be a bit more interesting to the audience that might be less familiar for NHS organisations is the kind of National Town Deal programme. So that's a programme that's predominantly aimed at local authorities that is available to 100 towns nationally, that's mainly targeted around improving kind of economic outcomes and employment outcomes, for example. But because we work really, really closely with our local authorities around improving outcomes as a whole, so for example, we have a 10-year gap in life expectancy within each of both of our boroughs. And I guess the point that kind of we made to our local authorities was, well, it's actually going to be really difficult to improve outcomes in terms of employment or economy unless people are healthy, and therefore we should dedicate some of that funding to improving health facilities and access to health. So relatively small amounts of money compared to some of the figures that Fiona was talking about, but at a local provider level, those town deal ones, for example, we have opened a new, what we've called a Living Well hub within one of our town centres, using that funding. So that was £3 million worth of town deal funding. We've secured another £3 million within our other borough and are planning to open something very similar, which is a health and education hub. So also kind of links to what Fiona was talking about earlier in terms of that shift of care into the community, which I think is a real opportunity in terms of estates, because if we are able to find alternative funding sources to create community facilities for health, what that will, as well as kind of that helping to address health inequalities and support regeneration, that will also help to reduce the cost of acute hospitals going forwards. And that's very much part of our strategy. So we know that we need 2 new hospitals, but part of our strategy is to move as many services as we possibly can into the community, particularly into those areas within our communities where we know we have much poorer health outcomes. So for us, that's predominantly within our town centres, and to work really closely with partners to do that. We've also worked really closely with our local lift provider, who've invested in one of our lift facilities to allow us to put, for example, more breast screening into an existing lift facility, which is in a town centre. One of the other things that's been helpful to us is a recent change in terms of how the NHS can manage leases. So for anyone who wants to look it up afterwards, it is under an IFRS 16 regulation, which is a financial regulation, but essentially what it means is that NHS providers now need to capitalise leases. Now, actually, that's quite helpful, because what it means is if there is some capital available that needs to be spent quickly, we can use that to enter into a lease in a community facility, and therefore then provide services from that community facility longer term without incurring the same revenue costs that we would do on an annual basis if we were unable to capitalise that lease. So that, I think, is quite a significant change that is really helpful from an estate's perspective. So I guess, yeah, the funding kind of mechanisms have been something that we've kind of needed to look differently at, because we were unsuccessful in securing funding that we need really for our new hospitals. And I guess the final one to mention on that is one public estate. So I think it's another area where NHS trusts and organisations are perhaps less likely to access one public estate funding. Again, this is a national funding pot. What that fund is really helpful for is kind of pre-planning and feasibility assessments. So for example, we've used that to look at the opportunity to knock down some buildings on one of our sites and release that land for housing. And that also then links to relationships with the likes of Homes England, who might also be able to help us in terms of releasing that land going forwards. So we're also starting to look at any options of working with local housing associations and our local authority on how we might then release that land for housing and enable some kind of revenue return from an NHS perspective too. So I think they're probably some of the key things that we've been looking at. Just to Fiona's point around kind of scaling and sharing learning, because I think that's why it's important to me to be able to kind of join in some of these sessions like this, because it's been really difficult. It's been really difficult to get to where we've got to. So we've now got a Holton Health Hub, which is in a shopping centre. We've got the Living Well Hub, which is in Warrington Town Centre. So we've got 2 key health on the high street facilities. We've also got a 3-site community diagnostic centre. But that has not been without significant challenge. And so keen to share the challenges that we faced and how we've overcome some of those, and happy to share any details outside of the session as well.
Fantastic, Lucy. That's really helpful to hear about some of that very broad range of different approaches you've used, including accessing funding streams which are probably better known in the local government world than in the NHS. So I'm going to bring in Kieran finally, and then we'll come to questions from the audience. So Kieran, really just building on what others have already said, it'd be great to hear from your point of view what else is possible, and what support there is available for people that are wanting to kind of leverage different funding options. And also, if I may, just in my role as jargon buster, I wonder if you might just explain the point about core, flex and tail that's been mentioned a couple of times.
Yeah, I can pick up on that as well, Chris, and probably a little bit like Lucy, I'm likely to get a little bit animated on some of the opportunities, so do feel free to rein me in. So if we start with the core flex tail, working alongside colleagues in NHS England, we effectively, as part of the ICB estate strategy piece, categorised the estate into core flex tail. So effectively, the core estate is the estate that we need long term to maintain the delivery of services. The tail estate is that estate which we envisage becoming surplus for clinical use in the short term. So your limited investment, and invariably we'll dispose or release ourselves from the leasing obligations around those. And the flex may be that the flex estate, if it's well utilised and central to some of the services, we'll continue to invest in that to bring it up to a condition B, or some of the flex estate might actually, over a period of time, move into that tail pot and will effectively dispose of that. So it's effectively about ending up with an estate that's fit for purpose and a long-term requirements to meet the long-term requirements of the NHS. And actually, as part of the ICB's estate strategy piece, I know our own strategy team helped about 15 of the ICBs do that analysis across their estate and help them plan investment around that. I think one of the key opportunities, given the age profile and the size of the NHS estate, now while it presents us with lots of headaches, by the very nature, it also presents us with a lot of opportunities. And I think we do need to be maybe a little bit more innovative in our approach to helping ourselves meet some of those funding challenges. Within sort of every local planning authorities have a pot of developer funding. So this is a pot of funding from commercial development that's allocated to help fund infrastructure in those local planning authority and local authority areas. And at any one point, that pot nationally could be as much as £7 billion to access. Historically, the NHS has secured less in education and transport. I think the last number we had available was from 2019, when the NHS as a whole secured about 180 million in the year out of a pot of about 7 billion. So our town planning team is working with about 20% of the ICBs at the moment. We've built out a pipeline of £100 million worth of bids on that local authority development funding pot. And we've secured 35 million in funding over the last 2 years for NHS and ICB estate. One of the added benefits actually of that source of funding is that it doesn't score to that CDEL budget that Nicola explained earlier. So effectively, it doesn't eat into the capital headroom the Department of Health has allocated. I think Lucy touched on leasing. So one of the things, many of us look at leasing as a liability, and it's but every time the NHS signs a lease with a commercial landlord, we're creating value for that commercial landlord. Now, in the wider property market, it's standard practice for both parties to share in that value. So from an NHS perspective, when we talk about sharing in that value, monies from that landlord could be used to invest in the estate, to change the condition of the property, or to help fund net zero and carbon reduction activities. In our own portfolio, we've undertaken a review of all of our leasehold estate, and we've identified up to 80 million of capital opportunities that we may be able to transact on over the next 5 years. Now, that's not to say that we'll crystallize all of those opportunities, but when we're having discussions with our landlords about renewing our leases or taking a new lease, we'll be looking for some of that value back from our commercial landlords. As I mentioned, and Fiona mentioned disposals, that's been a key part of our source of capital funding over the last 10 years. We've released over 550 million of capital from the sale of surplus properties, and that 550 million has all been reinvested back in our estate. And obviously, the sale of that surplus property also delivers significant revenue savings and helps to reduce the carbon footprint as well. There are a number of projects where there's an ongoing need. So the site itself might be redundant, but there's an ongoing need for health centre clinical use on that site. So in a number of instances, we're redeveloping those sites to deliver new health centres and using an element of that land, the surplus land, to reinvest into the health centre and to help fund the delivery of that health centre. And in one project in Chiswick in West London, working in partnership with the London Borough of Hounslow, we're delivering a new health centre, and with the surplus land we sold to the local planning authority, and in return, we'll get 55 affordable homes for NHS colleagues as part of that transaction. So we're unlocking capital, but we're also helping to address some of the issues around retention within the NHS and affordability for colleagues around accommodation. One of the things we talked about in multiple year capital cycles, a pragmatic approach to some of those activities, some of those initiatives actually helps build a sustainable multi-year capital pipeline, and we can flex that from year to year in some instances. And that's exactly what's needed to create that estate fit for the future.
Thank you, Kieran. Fantastic. So let's take some questions from the audience now. Before we do that, we've just released the latest poll, so people in the audience might want to have a look at that and see the results coming in. So we've got some fantastic questions from the audience. Thank you so much for submitting these. I'm going to take one from Joanne first. So Joanne's talking about the recent increases in construction and material costs and the challenges created by that, including when sort of national funding doesn't recognise those increases in costs. Joanne's saying that in her experience all but stalled the development of new primary care estate, and asks, how do the speakers see the sector addressing this challenge? Nicola, I wonder if I could come to you on that.
And I think, Joanne, it's such a difficult issue for us all, isn't it? I mean, Lucy's talked about the challenge of delivery in primary care, because things take so long and costs and values go up in the way that is unhelpful when we come to a long drawn out approvals process. I would play back the approach I suppose we've taken, which is that really getting the developers to deliver those shell and core options, and then within a tight timescale, being able to deliver the fit out, and therefore to manage that cost and cost inflation in a way that gives you more control. And at the same time, look at how we can be, and we're looking at putting more of a standardized approach around primary care. How do we try to do that with a design-led approach that recognizes where the pressures are around construction pricing? So there is no easy answer. I think the moral of the story is try and reduce the timescales down as far as possible and take out some of the variables, particularly partner variables. And secondly, really try to work, and I think all of us are doing this, how do we bring some of that innovation and insight to these projects so that we can manage costs in a way that we have greater influence over, but it's an issue.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm going to take another question from the audience, from Simon. So Simon's asking about the challenges of working with local authority partners, and clearly this is absolutely key. If we look at the shifts that the government are talking about making to health and care, they really rely on integrated working between the NHS, local authority, and other partners. But that kind of partnership working can throw up a whole set of other challenges, including one highlighted by Simon in relation to CDEL limits. Lucy, you've done a lot of work in your system that has involved local government as well. Do you want to come in on some of the challenges in doing so?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that we have a very positive working relationship with both of our local authorities, and actually it's been more of a opportunity and a help than it has been a challenge. Obviously, there's some challenges along the way. So I think, and it sounds really obvious, doesn't it? But I think those relationships have been absolutely key. And I know quite often, both in the NHS and in local authorities, there's quite often a change in people, isn't there? Which is sometimes unhelpful in this type of work. So I guess one of the things is I've been around for a while in this role, which has been massively helpful in terms of building some of those relationships. I think we were also, with Halton Borough Council in particular, we were a pilot site a long time ago for the NHS England Healthy New Towns programme, which that really kick-started our, I guess, more strategic estates relationship. And at that point, we developed a master plan for a part of Halton, which ever since then, we've kind of collectively sought different opportunities to be able to deliver on aspects of that plan. So that included things like providing health within the shopping centre, things like releasing part of the hospital estate for housing. And I think because we set that joint strategy probably about 7 years ago now, that we are kind of all committed to delivering on. I think that was a massive help in Halton in particular. I think also it's where there are kind of shared opportunities and shared aims. So a lot of the work that we've done around health on the high street has made a significant contribution to town centre regeneration, which is obviously a key priority for our local authorities. So that's why I think we've been able to secure funding together and be able to invest together. To the CDEL point, again, this is that collaboration with the council has been really helpful, because funding that we've secured via the council routes, via national programmes that the councils have access to, has then sat outside of our CDEL. So that means that essentially we're able to spend more capital than is within our allocation or our limit from an NHS provider perspective. So that's been a real positive. Also, there are opportunities around if the council, for example, hold the contract in terms of a refurbishment or a construction project, they have different rules in terms of the VAT that they're required to pay, which can also be an opportunity. So I think there's loads of benefits of working with our local authorities. We maintain some of those relationships. So for example, within Warrington, I lead a group that brings together the kind of estates strategies across all public sector partners, with some private sector input as well. And that then supports the development of our estate strategy at ICB level. So we do have that regular kind of place where we all come together to make sure that we can develop and deliver on our joint estate strategy. So sorry, I've probably not really said why it's bad, because generally I would say it's been great from our perspective.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you, Lucy. And you've addressed some of those challenges very well. We've got a few questions coming in on decarbonisation and the net zero agenda. So Tricia has asked a question about how can we find different ways of funding decarbonisation. Fiona, I'm going to come to you on this, but there's a few different questions that I want to roll into this. So You mentioned the public sector decarbonisation scheme, which is obviously one route. Tricia has also mentioned SALIX grants, but points out that they're given through a competitive process. There's also a question from Jean about specifically how do we fund decarbonisation of the primary care estate, and then a question from John asking for any helpful resources and guidance in relation to decarbonisation and energy efficiency. So Fiona, would you mind sort of taking a few of those together?
Sure, yeah, no worries at all. So I think, and what I'll do, Chris, probably if it's helpful. So I'll go backwards. So in terms of the kind of resources that are available, we have a collaboration hub which is accessible by anyone in the NHS. I'll send the link to the page on that, and anybody who's not, most of our stuff is published online on our website, so I'll send you the links to those. But we've set out very clearly our sort of strategy around new builds, so decarbonisation of new builds in the net zero building standard. We've got the net zero delivery plan, which deals with the retained estate, and then we've got greening, the kind of leased green leases guidance for the leased estate. We've also got some helpful guidance around greening the business case, looking at those sort of social aspects and how you could link in maybe with some of the local authority requirements for funding. So I'll kind of send you a list, and perhaps you could circulate that to the people on the call if that's helpful for everybody. I think in terms of decarbonisation, obviously we're working in the background very much to make sure that the NHS gets as much of the public sector decarbonisation scheme funding as we possibly can. We've done really well in that. And so much so that they actually put sector caps on because health was getting so much. But we've also proven delivery. So those schemes are really ramping forward. And I would just say to you, please continue to deliver those, because that really helps us to make the case for additional funding. There isn't really much else apart from that. There's public sector decarbonisation funding and CDEL. I think when we think about CDEL, though, we really need to think slightly differently. So we did a piece of work looking at the kind of carbon benefits of backlog maintenance. So what are the things that you could invest in from a decarbonisation perspective that would also reduce your backlog maintenance? And it's something like for every pound invested, we could get rid of 33p off of the backlog maintenance bill, reduce carbon. And I think we need to look at those things very specifically and say, is there a way that we can spend this £1 smartly? So we could do 1, 2, 3 things with it rather than just a singular thing. I said it earlier, but just be ready for in-year spend. We're still only at 51% coverage of LED lighting. For me, that's just a no-brainer. Payback just over a year. I think we need to start really focusing in on those spend to save schemes again. I think the government are starting to be open to that, and we're certainly putting that into our spending review bid. So looking at the things that are quick wins that aren't done everywhere. I wouldn't say that LED lighting is particularly innovative anymore, and we should just be doing it. So that comes to the sort of scale and just get those things done. But do be ready, because there are often pots of money. Get your estates teams dusting off their business cases, especially this year and next year. And I think in the longer term, obviously, we're speaking to government about the opportunities that might be provided by different funding routes. So things like power purchase agreements, they currently fall into the private finance kind of area. So that is, you buy power, somebody else installs the power, so solar, wind, some kind of renewables. They haven't quite done hydrogen yet, but there's a big hydrogen pipe work that's kind of planned for the future. And I think looking at how we can sort of leverage some of those things to get extra funding essentially for the NHS. We've committed to being net zero by 2040, so that's quite a tall order. But I do think that there's a big part to play in the productivity agenda as well, if we can just be really smart about being ready. That's probably all I'd say, Chris. I could go on, but
thanks, Fiona. We've got some questions come in that would touch on some really big issues, and I think I might just kind of take a couple of them and let you reflect and see who wants to come in on them. But there are a couple of questions that are about, you know, the tension between this enormous amount of kind of backlog maintenance issues that have built up. So I think someone mentioned the 13.8 billion figure already on the call. But we also need to modernize NHS facilities for future needs. So there's a question from Josepha about you know, what innovative funding models or strategies could we use to effectively address that backlog maintenance issue while also supporting the modernization? And I think you sort of touched on that in your last comments, Fiona. There's also another sort of big issue that I want to kind of bring in around, and it's something that lots of you have alluded to already, but the need for sort of long-term planning. And Dawn has asked a question about, particularly when we have funding that's available in Q4 of the year, how can that be spent more strategically in both quarter 4 and the following financial year, rather than being limited to what we can deliver in 3 months? So, a question on kind of long-term planning, and also a question on, you know, how do we sort of address the sort of dire need to fix backlog maintenance issues while also kind of making progress with the modernisation of NHS estates for the future? Who would like to come in first on that?
Shall I just start, Chris,
Go
just
ahead,
on
Nicola,
that backlog? I mean, there are no easy answers, and I think what's come out of today is everything has a challenge. But I think the observations I've made in this prioritization, which I think is just playing as a sort of recurring theme through all that we do. And what we have done, and has been really helpful, is we allocated a small amount of capital to support critical backlog that had a shared agenda. So what do I mean by that? So we have 10 trusts in our system. So we've a lot of trusts doing different things. And what we sought to do was working with those estate directors, and importantly, also the finance directors. So this was a really good way of bringing estates and finance together to identify those backlog items that could benefit different trusts and could also enable us to manage some of our critical infrastructure. So how could we invest collectively in a small number of projects to show the art of the possible in some ways, in order to be able to start to move on that we have 121 million of critical backlog. So how could we do that in a more collective way than we've done individually? Now, there are no simple answers to that, but what it's started to do is create a bit of a movement amongst our trusts to explore what we might do more creatively as a system, as well as taking individual organisations and both finance and estate directors with us. So it's that small steps towards something which starts to create some shared priorities. And that links in then to the productivity agenda that Lucy has talked about, Kieran and Fiona. So how do we tackle and identify what those might look like, and how do we then identify some shared planning, shared funding to be able to do that over time in order to be able to secure some wider benefits, not just individual organisational benefits. So that's not an easy answer, nor is it something that's going to deliver overnight. I think it's the beginning of a process that hopefully enables us to achieve a better management of some of those shared critical risks. And secondly, just on the longer term planning, I mean, we've mentioned it in passing. I've certainly found the infrastructure strategies a really good way of getting this on the ICB board's agenda. So we've had good engagement, we've had really good feedback, we've had chief execs starting to reference it. That's been a way of setting out what our key principles are, our need for consistency, need for priorities, need to use our capital to meet our system priorities and not just the urgent. And that has helped us in that objective of some long-term planning. So when funding does come over the horizon, we are better placed to have invested in our projects so they are quasi-oven ready. And secondly, we know who the partners are that we need to work with in order to meet the challenge of delivery. So hopefully that provides a bit of a framing of that response.
Thank you, Nicola. Really helpful. Fiona, do you want to come in on these themes around kind of longer term planning and balancing the sort of the needs of today and the needs of the future? What would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, so anyone who's been in the NHS for any period of time will know that the NHS is just a continual balance of immediate versus long term, and even not long term, medium term. So you've always got one eye on the here and now, and you've got money to spend and you need to do it, and this is falling over and we need to fix that, versus actually we need to move to a more digital estate. We need to look at, you know, what do we need and how do we get there? We need to look at the big agenda items for decarbonisation, to moving to prevention. So there's always that kind of balance. I think, as Nicola said, I mean, there's no quick answer. If we had the quick answer, we'd be doing the quick answer. I think the long-term planning can actually really help with that in-year spend, though. If you've got a plan, you've got a program, and if that's scalable, so you know that there are within projects you could do this, but actually if you were pushed you could do this. I think if people start to think in that way, that could really help you to spend that money on projects that are already in flight, but just accelerate them. Maybe what are the add-ons? You know, here's your project, this is what you do within your capital envelope, but actually if you got some money in Q4, maybe you could add on that bit of digital. Maybe you could add on something that would make it net zero. Maybe you could add on something that would bring additional benefit. So I think just thinking slightly differently. Excuse me. The second thing, coming back to Kieran's point on core, flex and tail, I think, you know, we talk about how do we modernise and how do we move, and I think some of those basics need to be done first. So, you know, looking at your estate that you're absolutely going to stick with no matter what, and prioritising your investment there. So you always know that you're going to have this core estate. That is your core estate. It's what you're going to operate no matter what happens. Make sure that those bits of long-term planning are focused around your core estate first. You know, how could you use that? Because that will never be money that's wasted. The worst thing is when you spend something quickly to do something, and then, I don't know, next year, the year after, you dispose of it, or, you know, you rent it out to a local authority. So I think just thinking about your estate slightly differently, and using the long-term planning as a way to respond to that more immediate ask.
Thank you, Fiona. That's really helpful. And we are coming towards the end of our time together, and I'm fighting my urge to ask more questions from the audience because there's lots of really fantastic questions that we haven't managed to come to. Apologies. But I wonder if, just to kind of close the session, if I could come to each of the panelists just for really the sort of magic wand question, I guess. So if you could do one thing, if we could have one thing that would make a difference to funding the NHS estate of the future, what would it be? I'm going to come to you in reverse order. So Kieran first, if that's okay.
I think actually picks up probably on the backlog point, Chris. I think we need to start planning for the future. So when we are building and delivering new schemes, we need to look at life cycling costs and build in life cycling costs as part of the investment case, so that we are effectively budgeting for the revenue to maintain the estate over 20, 25 and 30 years. We look at our estate and we think, well, invariably there's no incentive to move out of the old, maybe not the most efficient property because it's cost effective. But actually that's a false economy, because all you're doing is storing up that backlog cost. So if there's one thing I think we could do as part of the business case planning, as part of those capital bids and revenue bids, we start to plan for the estates of the future, and we start to budget for that life cycle cost so we can replace and keep the property in a condition as it is in day one.
Thanks, Kieran. If I come to Lucy next for closing thoughts from you.
Thanks, Chris. And I think it links to a lot of what we've discussed, but what if we could have one thing, I think it would be the ability to have multi-year estates plans and investment plans to help prevent the need to spend money quickly, but also looking back to one of Fiona's earlier points, to make sure that we are then spending the money that is based on need, rather than having lots of different pots for different things. I think it would be able to really focus on that need over multiple years.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Nicola, your
Yep.
concluding thoughts, please.
Thank you. And linked to the point that Lucy's made, I think I would add to that, which is capital planning and a 3-5 year plan to support that. But behind that, we need to have that revenue in order to be able to do early scheme development, to build confidence and trust with our partners that we will deliver what we say we will do. We can then start bringing that timescales in, which I think is one of the big issues that we have. The longer things take, the more expensive they come. To build that trust and confidence, because we've done some of the early work to get ourselves to the start point, and then that gives us the ability to deliver more quickly, to deliver with greater confidence, and actually meet those wider health outcomes that obviously sit at the heart of what we do. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicola. And over to Fiona for final words.
Thanks, Chris. So, I mean, I would reflect on exactly the same as the rest of the panelists have said, really long-term planning. So get your ICS infrastructure strategies. Anybody who hasn't heard of those, go to the NHS England website, look them up, really clear guidance there. Make sure they are ready, because that will make sure that any investment that you do get, whether it's short-term or longer term, is really spent in the right way, but be ready for in-year funding. And I would just, I'll use this opportunity, I would say to everybody, please get engaged with the 10-year plan. If you go to change.nhs.uk, there's a massive public consultation happening at the moment about how we shape the NHS for the future. So all of these things that you're all struggling with, feed it in, because it will make a difference to how the government responds going forward. And I would just really personally encourage everybody to do that.
Thank you very much, Fiona. So thank you to all of you for a really rich discussion today. Thank you again to our event sponsor, NHS Property Services, as well. And also thank you to all of you for watching in the audience. This is available on demand as well until 19th of January, so you can share it with colleagues. And finally, we'd really value your feedback on this session today. We're going to be sending out a survey link shortly, or you can go to the feedback option in the menu on the left. But we really do appreciate hearing from you, because it helps us to improve our events continually. So thank you again to everyone, and hope to see you again next time.